I'd now like to welcome to the stage to have our first morning conversation, Mr. Mark Beer, who is OBE and chairman of the Metis Institute based in Oxford, and also Professor Goldin, who's the Professor of Globalisation and Development at the University of Oxford. Mark will introduce Professor Goldin when they come on stage, but if gentlemen you'd like to make your way up here now, that would be lovely. And prior to Mark taking over as the head of the Metis Institute, he was previously head of the English language courts in Dubai for the United Arab Emirates. Gentlemen, welcome, and I hand it over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, good morning, everybody, and what a glorious, sunny, beautiful London day it is. For those that are here, I hope you're enjoying all the splendours of London. For those that are not here, I'm very much hoping that they come and visit soon. As Paul said, I'm the chairman of the Metis Institute, which helps governments redefine themselves to be more attractive investment environments. And what could be more important than travel and tourism? And it is a huge honour, truly an honour, to introduce one of Oxford's best-known professors, Professor Ian Goldin. He is Oxford University's Professor of Globalisation and Development and has initiated many firsts at Oxford, including, I believe, very much being instrumental in the foundation of the Oxford Martin School and the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. But Ian has also been Vice President of the World Bank, as well as the Director of the World Bank's Development Policy. He's been in business as Chief Executive and Managing Director of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And he's been a close personal advisor to Mr. Nelson Mandela. The author of many books, a knight, at least in France, a TV presenter, and a triathlete. Can we please give a huge round of applause to welcome Ian to the stage to answer the question, what does the global economy hold for the future?
Thank you very much, Mark, for those kind words. And it really is a huge pleasure to be here. I feel like we all like butterflies coming out of cocoons into a new world again. And it's wonderful to be in a physical event and also to be able to connect with those around the world who are benefiting from the hybrid meeting. My hope is that we can restore very rapidly the travel and tourism sector because, as Taleb has so eloquently said, this is the heartblood of economies. This is the way you get people back to work, particularly those in hospitality and other sectors who've been so disadvantaged during the pandemic. It's the way you overcome inequality. It's the way you sustain growth. Let me share some good news and bad news in my vision of the coming years and the world economy. The great news is that we are experiencing, and I think will over the next 18 months, the most rapid economic rebound in 80 years. So this is a historical moment of coming back, of I hope, not bouncing back or bouncing forward along the same road we were before, because that's the road that led us over the precipice into the pandemic to catastrophic climate change and other things. I hope we are using this as an opportunity to build back stronger, to build back in ways that will create sustainable and inclusive growth, in which travel and tourism will be very much at the heart of this. So this strong rebound comes from a really dreadful 2020. It comes on top of what for the UK, where we are here, has been a particularly bad time. In fact, the UK, of all the major economies, has contracted the most, by about 10% in 2020. But we expect, and I expect, that the coming years will see much better news over this. I'm projecting about 7% growth for the UK economy this year, about 5% for next. It should be said, however, that it would be much better if it wasn't for Brexit and the pandemic. The pandemic has knocked about 2% off sustainable growth in the long term for the pandemic. We won't get back to that till about 2025. Brexit has been much worse. Brexit's had about double the impact on the British economy than the pandemic, about -4%. But we will see a return to growth. The world economy is likely to grow by about 6% this year, about 5% next year. It's fantastic news. And quite widely distributed. The US, very similar numbers. Europe, very strong. Europe's likely to be stronger than Britain in many respects, and because it didn't fall back so far, many countries like Germany and France, not Italy, which did take a terrible knock, are likely to see sustained growth. China, of course, was the only major economy in the world that did not contract in 2020. It enjoyed about 2.5% growth, and China is likely to grow by about 8% this year, 6% next year. The economic center of global gravity, as a result, is more rapidly moving to East Asia. Not only China, but South Korea, Vietnam, other countries in the region have done remarkably well. Of course, the big question for China, like it is for New Zealand and Australia, is how do you exit? How do you exit from isolation? Because China is such a big economy, that's less of a challenge for China than it is for New Zealand, for example, or Australia, which are absolutely hyper-dependent on integration with the world. So China, I'm optimistic about, and the vaccination rates are improving. India had a terrible 2020, contracted by about 8%. Devastating consequences, particularly for poor people in India, the pandemic. But this year should grow by about 7%, and next year about the same. So really strong bounce back. And their vaccination rates are pretty strong. They're already at about 1/3 of the population double vaccination, from a very poor start, a very rapid increase. I can go through many other countries. Good news. Improvements everywhere. Some of the slowest rebound, unfortunately, in Africa, particularly South Africa, big economy, Nigeria, slow rebound from negative territory in 2020. And that's partly because vaccination has had such a poor distribution. The global distribution of vaccines has been so bad. So only 4% of Africans have been double vaccinated at this point, compared to about 2/3 of Europeans, for example, 2/3 of people in the US. This is extremely worrying, and of course vaccine distribution is critical to recovery, as we know here. The worrying clouds on the horizon are numerous, and my very positive projections carry more than their normal caveats. The first is what's going to happen with the pandemic and whether we are likely or not to have a new variant. That in particular is a concern, which could be more virulent and indeed could even be evasive to vaccines that we have today. That would set us all back dramatically again. Until we have much higher levels of vaccination and are able to contain the pandemic, particularly across Africa, that risk is multiplying all the time, the risk of mutation. And it's a selfish reason, if one needs selfish reasons, and I don't believe one should rely on them, why we need to improve vaccine distribution around the world. So where we go, whether we get new variants, and whether we can continue to stay open and open up, particularly China, remains the key uncertainty going forward. I'm optimistic, but only cautiously so. The second big question is, where do we go with unwinding stimulus, and what's the relationship to inflation and interest rates? This matters dramatically. It matters more than ever because the rich economies particularly, but also many developing countries, have taken on enormous amounts of debt during the crisis. We have seen debt levels soar to levels that would have been simply unimaginable in January 2020. That means that we are very sensitive to increases in interest rates. We're in the remarkable situation that despite this massive quantitative easing, in other words, printing of money and taking on debt, which has kept our economies afloat and which accounts for this rebound, the cost of servicing debt is lower today for many economies than it was in 2018, for example. That's because interest rates are so low. As soon as interest rates start going up, that whole calculation changes. A bigger share of our budgets goes into interest repayments, and we can't issue much more debt. So we have to withdraw the stimulus. And indeed, that's beginning to happen. This stimulus has been the biggest thing that's ever happened in history economically. Much bigger than the stimulus after the Second World War, for example. We're talking about $20 trillion of stimulus. This is bigger than the entire US economy of stimulus. This is 7 times the size of the UK economy in global stimulus. This is massive. It's never happened at this scale before. And it's the money that's gone into the furlough schemes, into the compensation schemes, into sending checks to workers in the US, into the infrastructure bills, and into many other things. And that's why we're seeing this remarkable rebound. I think it's been a very good idea. I'm totally supportive of it, but the devil is in the detail. Is the stimulus going into growth, or is it going into consumption? Now, those of you that are students of history will remember a stimulus of a century ago.
Same here.
Good. So my name's Liam. I'm part of the production team here at the ITIC conference. Don't get too worried about what's going on the screen now. It's just the talk that's going on before you. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. If you could turn it on for me, yeah, that'd be great. Just so we can make sure that we've got you all ready to go.
We tested the lighting and the position.
Yes, yeah, it looks absolutely perfect. Can I just check there's no presentation as such with this? You're not expecting slides or anything like that?
No, just a panel.
Cool, perfect. Just thought I'd double check. That's what I've got written down. I just thought I'd double check.
Now and to find out later.
Absolutely.
They're just talking. So.
Yeah, that's cool. No worries. So can I just make sure that you can see the gentleman talking now, and he's full screen and he's all fitting in for you.
And then I've got you on the right side of the screen.
Yeah, that's fine. When the session's actually starting, I'll take off my mic and my camera anyway.
Down Outlook now. So.
Stimulus spent on cement and steel leads to very rapid increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's vital that the stimulus packages are part of a Green New Deal.
Would you bear with me for 2 minutes? I just need to sort something out. Thank you very much.
I'll turn the camera off and go on mute, should I?
That's lovely, thank you.
More thoughtfully for cities, for travel and tourism, and for other sectors. A high inflation environment which we experience at the moment, in the UK inflation is over 3% at the moment, in some parts of the world over 4%. This is high by the standards of the last 30 years. We have the highest inflation rates for well over 30 years at the moment. Is this temporary or is this long term? That is the key question that economists are pondering over, central bankers and others. My own view is that we don't yet know because it depends on the response of many policymakers. In the UK, are we going to give more visas? Are we going to let migrant workers in to overcome the critical skill shortages, for example? That's a political decision. In Europe, what is going to be the response in terms of diversification of energy sources and movement? I'm much more optimistic on inflation coming down in Europe than I am in the UK. US, I believe it will come down. But it does depend critically on people being prepared to go back to work. A lot of this supply shortage on labor is due to reluctance of people to go back to the jobs they had before. And that is about employers safeguarding their workers, and also it will lead to better working conditions, which in the medium term will be extremely positive. So I'm optimistic that this inflation is short-lived, and it also will require, and this is where the pain starts hurting for some groups of people, a rapid reduction in stimulus packages. Quantitative easing needs to slow, it will slow, but the question is, how does it slow? And do we ensure that we don't increase inequality further? Inequality has escalated dramatically during the pandemic. Not only health inequalities, which we see with, for example, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups 4 times as likely to have died of COVID-19 in the UK, in Europe, in the US than other groups, but economically. Within countries and between countries, this dramatic increase in inequality. And that's partly because professional and middle-income groups have been able to work remotely. Those in hospitality have suffered dramatically, and of course, it's been very regionally concentrated. Getting back to offices, getting back to work is absolutely essential, and that's why vaccination is at the key of all of this. Making people feel safe, and particularly those that are vulnerable, feeling safe in it. That's happening. It's happening rapidly, and of course, I believe employers should encourage it. What employers do in terms of encouraging people to go back to offices is vital, I believe, not only for the creativity and viability of cities, which depend absolutely on the ecosystem of people being in them, but also extraordinarily significantly for young people and those coming into work. All jobs are apprenticeships. We learn not by reading books, but we learn, or watching something on Zoom, we learn through experience, through being in interactive environments with others. This isn't only true of law and banking and travel and tourism and hospitality. This is true across the board. And of course, you cannot do this as effectively on Zoom. So coming back to offices will not only lead to higher levels of productivity, but I believe more creativity and allow people to grow into jobs, to challenge to their firms and to have more vibrant economies. The rate of what economists think of as creative destruction, the rate of bankruptcies, the rate of new firm formation, the rate of investment has slowed. There's been a concentration in the superpowers firms, like the technology industries, and we need to get back to a competitive environment in our economies if we are to have sustainable growth. And of course, it's small businesses, not least in hospitality, that account for the majority of job creation, particularly for lower income people. And it's that which we so vitally need, which is why the theme of this conference is essential. The travel and tourism that puts back through jobs, through growth, through ensuring that it is able, particularly for young people and those that are marginalized, to find jobs. Absolutely vital. So the fault lines that have opened through the pandemic need to be closed through deliberate action. This requires not only policymakers at the national and regional global level, it requires employers to do their bit to ensure, to create the working environment. It also requires more solidarity. The Sustainable Development Goals, which Taleb referred to, have been totally derailed by this pandemic. The World Bank estimates that 150 million more people have been thrown into absolute poverty during the pandemic. The World Food Programme estimates that about 160 million people have been pushed into severe malnourishment. This is the second-order effects of countries being starved of travel and tourism, of remittances from migrant workers, of being isolated. And that needs to be overcome through connectivity, through ensuring that we're able to get the global flows moving. Now, globalization is the source of the greatest progress in the history of humanity. By globalization, I mean flows across national borders of investment, of tourists, of travel, of things like vaccines, like light bulbs, of people. But it also is the source of our greatest risks. And that's what we see in the pandemic. The super spreading of the bads as well as the goods through it, what I call the butterfly defect of globalization. And it's that which needs to be more effectively managed. For every financial center, there's a risk of financial cascading crises and contagion. For every airport hub, there's a risk of the super spreading of a pandemic. Through every cyber server, there's the risk of the spreading of a cyber virus. Through every time we enjoy the benefits of connecting new people to electrification, there's a risk, or transport, there's a risk of escalating climate change. For every time we take an antibiotic, there's a risk of growing antimicrobial resistance. And so as we climb the development ladder, as we become wealthier and what we do begins to change the planet and impacts on others, we need to take on more responsibility as individuals in our actions, our choices, and of course, cities and countries and firms need to be more responsible in what they do. The wealthier they are, the more they impact on the planet and on other places and people. And that responsibility is the problem. Taleb and I served on the Chief Executive Board of the United Nations. We see that the system is totally unfit for 21st century purpose. We need urgent reform, we need to reinforce the World Health Organization, and we need to give more solidarity. At a time when the rich countries have found $20 trillion for themselves, they've found less than 100 billion, less than 1/4% for the rest of the world. Indeed, the UK has cut its aid by 1/3 when it's never been more needed. We're living through the biggest development disaster in history, certainly of our lifetimes, and yet we are not showing the solidarity. So my projections for the global economy are optimistic. I believe we are experiencing a most remarkable rebound in the last 80 years. At the same time, we cannot be complacent for a second. This is extremely uneven in its geographical distribution. There are people around the world suffering in greater numbers than in our lifetimes of the past in terms of reversals. And of course, unless we do the right thing by distributing vaccines, by ensuring that this investment stimulus goes into health, education, and growth, not consumption alone, we risk a derailing of this recovery. It's a time for responsible leadership, it's a time for responsible employment, but it's also a time to celebrate, because thankfully we can be here together and the travel and tourism sector is rebounding. Thank you very much.